This is the Philanthropy Show, connecting and inspiring philanthropy.
And here we are. Welcome to the Philanthropy Show. Here we are, Portland State University in the beautiful Portland, Oregon. It is so wonderful to be here. I'm your host, Louanne Saraga Walters. This is the National Conference for the Alliance for Nonprofit Management 2015. And this campus is amazing, right in the downtown of Portland, Oregon. We have spent the last couple of days just totally enjoying this city. It is so beautiful. It is not flat like Florida, as my legs can attest to, having run the 26.2 marathon a few days ago, which was incredibly well organized and just so beautiful. We have a live studio audience. We're so happy that you guys are here. And today we're looking at collaborating with business and government, which the reason we're doing this session is because we had just done a show in Northeast Florida with a survey of 90 plus nonprofits that showed their hesitance to get involved in collaborating with businesses and with government, and for a variety of reasons. Well, it just so happens that there are other studies that have been done across the United States, including one here, a 5-state survey done in 2014, which was led by one of our guests today in that push for this 5-state study. So we're going to take a look at what's behind this hesitance, and how can we really achieve that buzzword, collective impact, by dropping the fear factor, by looking at how we can get into it together. So we've got business representatives, we've got nonprofits, and we've got government. And so let's just get into it. I'd like to introduce you to our guests today. Starting on my far left, we have Jim White, who is the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. And he was the lead I was talking about in that 5-state study, the 2014 Northwest Nonprofit Survey. Yeah? Thank you, Jim, for coming on the show. Mayra Arreola, did I do good?
Yes.
Oh, yay, good. Director of Community Collaborations and Investment with United Way of Columbia, Willammette. She's also done some extensive work in rural communities. So one of the things I love about the guests is that we have a variety of regional, we have a variety of rural, we have a variety of larger statewide and also national representation here. To my right, Liesl Wendt, Director of Multnomah County's Department of County Human Services, and she's also an alum of Portland State University, right,
yes,
in sociology, fantastic. And she's had an interesting outlook because she spent some time in Africa and Europe, which gave her kind of a systemic look at the framework of collaborations and how that's affecting change. And then to my far right, John Brothers, President of T. Rowe Price Foundation, who this is so timely for us because he has written a book entitled, couldn't get any more perfect than this, Rebalancing Public Partnerships, Innovative Practice Between Government and Nonprofits from Around the World, which will be released this fall. John takes it up a notch because it's also looking at, you looked at a dozen different countries around the world and how they're doing things. So that's what I love about these conferences. Best practice sharing. So welcome, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for coming. I want to start with the definition of collaboration. Get us all on the same page. Jim, you and I talked a little bit about this, and from my understanding of collaboration for this show, we're really looking at when organizations come together, business, government, they have different strengths and skills, but one goal in mind, and they have certain metrics that they're looking for. How were you looking at that with the 5-state survey?
Right, so through the 5-state survey, and I should also give a little bit of a shout out to our other 4 states, Alaska, Washington, Montana, and Idaho. I was a co-leader in this, I didn't lead it. We very much use a chaotic model, which in and of itself is a type of collaboration where there's no central backbone, if you will, for the collaboration that we did. But the 5-state survey that we did a breakout by state of what the different feelings of nonprofits are. We had 1,262 responses across the 5 states, with 250 right here in Oregon. These are Oregon-based nonprofits. And what we found was the lowest ranked capacity for nonprofits to come together to address big issues was with government. The second lowest was with business. And that was very concerning to us, to hear that nonprofits had felt that collaboration was something that was certainly something they wanted to aspire to. They recognized it's difficult, but that they, out of the entire survey set of questions, felt that the toughest group for them to collaborate with was the public sector. We did not give people a definition for collaboration in this. We simply let them self-determine. We are about to launch this year's survey, which will come out in late October, early November. And we are working right now with some specialists to deep dive into better question sets that would try to figure out what do people think collaboration means, and then what types of collaborations with government or the private sector are they particularly challenged by.
Do you think that, Mayra, again, reminding the audience and our online audiences with United Way, were you surprised by the results of this, that people are hesitant?
No, I think that there's, in order for there to be a successful collaboration, there's a lot that has to go into it. And one is the context, the environment, but also the parties or the organizations or agencies represented. And I do think that creates, in some way allows for a lot of creativity and problem solving and new ways of thinking. Yet there's, things that come with it, which are, different requirements, funding, delay in payments, or just doing things differently. So I think that if it also requires some discomfort or uncomfortable level of getting to know each other and learning really how things work, even within the organizations, to
Finding
really
that synergy.
Yeah, creating that synergy. So I think that it's in some ways it wasn't shocking, yet it also is a testament that there's a lot of work to be done to improve collaborative processes, particularly between nonprofits and government.
That question of how do we do this? How do we launch it? How do we find your skill set, my skill set? Liesl, something that Jim just said, though, too, about the hesitance, maybe the doubt in working with government. And I will tell you, that's one of the big issues that the nonprofits mentioned from Northeast Florida, in part because they received their funding. I think it was 60% of them, yes, more than half had received government funding, but then they had received delays in receiving that funding. So I can kind of understand the hesitance and collaboration on there. Can you speak a little bit more on the government nonprofit relationship?
Absolutely. I think what we all can see is that when the two are working together is when the best synergy happens. And yet I think government tends to come at things from a transactional perspective. We contract for Y service. And so the transformation at government levels, from electeds to departments to the staff actually managing the contracts, is to shift. So how are we not just managing, giving you dollars to provide X service, but we're working out those details with you before we even procure for services. And that's not government's comfort zone. How do we become vulnerable? To Jim's point around embracing the chaotic model is not government's safety zone, right? So how do we say to partners, we want to improve high school graduation rates. How might we do that together? What are you already doing in the community? How might government dollars come into that mix? Government tends to come in at the end and say, we want to buy graduation rates with a contract. And then you lose that opportunity for the creativity that I think is inherent in collaboration. So I think we have to roll it back and really build those relationships between nonprofits, funders, people who are on the ground doing the work, so that there's that pre-work and those relationships of trust, so that we can actually get to those better outcomes.
And it's interesting that you say that, because you're kind of speaking to the structure that we're used to working with. And I know, John, you really did some analysis of that. Does the structure that we have for collaboration work?
So, I think when I started doing my doctoral work on this, we analyzed the relationship between the federal government and the nonprofit sector. And one of the things that we noticed is that often government folks, when they thought of the nonprofit sector, really just widely didn't have a really good understanding of what makes nonprofits tick, right? So when we asked communication directors in Senate offices, tell me about nonprofit sector, they said, oh, I love the March of Dimes, right? And so understanding kind of the underneath the hood of what makes nonprofits. But on the flip side, when we surveyed nonprofit leaders from around the country, we asked them, tell us about government. And they largely didn't want to have anything to do with government other than to get contracts. And so when you have that dichotomy of wanting very specific things without, and you mentioned relationships, like when I met my wife, it took a long time before she finally said yes, and I think I had to do a lot of relationship building to make that relationship
I love
work,
that
right?
example.
So
That's beautiful.
it's the same thing there. If
Yeah.
and government funds a significant portion of what goes on in the social safety net, and so to be able to understand what makes government tick, what makes your office tick, is important. But also on your side, if you're contracting with a large number of organizations, it's going to take time on the government side to be able to do that. And quite frankly, that's not happening. So.
Looking at who we are and what we do, it is, I mean, we all laughed at that, but the really interesting thing is a lot of, well, even within our own nonprofit sector, we don't understand what each other does necessarily. We come at this from I'm with XYZ nonprofit and my mission is to da-da-da-da, and that doesn't necessarily always tell me what that end result is, what that community impact is. Mayra, this is a question for you because I know you've done community-based work. At what point, what does a community need, I think, to feel understood or to feel a connection with the entities that are trying to organize a collaboration around it? Do you understand what I'm saying? It's really community driven.
Mm-hmm. I do think that it's important to have organizations that are doing important and critical work in the community that want to come together to share best practices, share knowledge, understand exactly how it is that they all work before trying to come up with a specific, okay, this is what we can do together. And I do think that requires a certain level of kind of internal conversations and getting to know, the relationships, the people. But then at some point you have to go back outward and say, hey, this is what all these agencies are, identifying as a need. Is this reflective? Is this accurate? And then engage the clients or the families, the students, whoever is you're serving back to kind of validate or say, yes, but you're missing this very specific point that no other agency is really, servicing, or nobody is really understanding or focusing on, that is missing, that really is what is kind of the it factor that creates the change at the end. So I do think that communities need to be involved and need to have representation, because they also need to have understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve and who are you and why are you coming together. Otherwise, it just becomes another project that somebody on the side is doing.
And that's interesting, because what you just said, I think we have seen replicated nationwide, that there might be, and sometimes it's funding driven. If I can collaborate with another nonprofit, maybe I can get a little more money out of this funder to be able to drive this collective impact forward in some capacity. But it's less about, and tying, there is so much here, this is a task. It's about tying the relationship to the community need to find out what is it that we can do from a collaborative standpoint. How can you start that process?
I think nonprofits sometimes look at government money and how do we get that, and it's so much more complicated than that. And so I think for a community to really learn and hone the research of what is government's interest, because government's interest is tied to elected officials and decision makers and requirements, and that takes some investment of time. And then I think conversely, how can government get out of their offices, get out of their cubes, become vulnerable, share information, take risks, put information out without knowing exactly where the outcome is going to be, take the time to do the relationship building that you mentioned. So I think each side needs to do a little bit of coming to the middle, and it requires each stepping out of where they're comfortable.
What are some of the other issues that we see around the hesitance? I know nonprofits have very specific goals in mind, and a lot of those goals drive the funding. To be able to show that we did this, this, and this is what brings in that annual event funding. So what are some of the hesitations?
Another piece of data that we picked up in this 5-state survey was the very large, what we felt was a pretty significant gap between the way that organizations believe that they're effective in accomplishing their mission, which they rated very high, to the organization has sufficient capacity to do exactly that.
Wow.
They rated much lower. So the question becomes very much around resources. It becomes very transactional, and yet the organizations believe in many cases, we're interpreting that right now as they believe that they have some kind of a magic bullet. And I think we all need to come to collaboration with a real sense of humility, which is very challenging for both government and nonprofits.
I think nonprofits need to, as a grant maker now, I spend a lot of my time, the first question I ask with my prospective grantees is, how much does that cost? which for me is a strategic question, and for often I find that many nonprofits don't know the answer. And so it's really hard to talk about collaborating in meaningful ways if you don't know exactly what you're collaborating for, and specifically you're probably collaborating around some kind of resource injection. The second point is, I've been to 1 million collaborative meetings with nonprofits, and I have never seen one meeting start where they've brought their balance sheets. And so working in a large company, when we talk about collaborating, and I am not one to say copy corporate world, right? But I do notice that when you're talking about collaborating on the corporate side, you're talking about the real exchange of resource. I have something, you have something, let's exchange. On the nonprofit side, and also in government oftentimes, it's the exchange of information, which is really valuable, but it's not the exchange of resource. So I remember going into a community in Chicago in which there were 16 nonprofits. A funder asked me to meet with them, and they said, John, they're asking for $1.2 million of funding. We don't think it costs that. And I asked the group, put on the wall what you have in assets, and on the other side, what you need. And let's do a Chuck Woolery love connection for anybody who knows who Chuck Woolery is. And at the end of the time, they only really needed $210,000. So the idea is collaborating around the exchange of resources, really an activity that nonprofits don't spend enough time, and it relates to collective impact, right? So, but it's something that nonprofits need to be really good at before they go and approach anybody.
Everybody has a need, at least, that needs to be fulfilled, right? It can't be all give and then all take from the recipients or the givers. Everybody is giving and taking in some capacity in a true collaboration. So we're going to take a look at that, but right now we're going to head to a quick break, and we'll be back with more on the Philanthropy Show coming from Portland State University in lovely Portland, Oregon. We'll be right back. Whether you're a solo entrepreneur, running a small business, or a nonprofit, finding ways to promote and differentiate your business can be challenging, especially in the world of video messaging. In this course, I'll show you how to create 5 video styles which have proven effective for other businesses, and you've probably seen a few of them on TV crafted by major brands. But you don't have to be a Fortune 1000 company to produce these quality videos. You just need to understand their structure and how you fit into them. Throughout this course, I will teach you these 5 basic videos and how you can easily and professionally produce them yourself. Each style suits a different purpose and can be used across multiple platforms, which is essential to having real impact. Okay, are you ready? Enroll today at thephilanthropyshow.com. Welcome back to the Philanthropy Show. Here we are, Portland State University, Portland, Oregon, talking about collaborating with businesses and government at the Alliance for Nonprofit Management's annual conference this year, 2015. Some great conversation around this. First segment, we talked about some of the barriers to collaboration, and we started to touch on the needs of the different participants, collaborators, the nonprofits, the funders, the businesses, the government. So let's look at that a little bit further. John, you were talking about the needs of and I think Jim, you mentioned it as well, that nonprofits obviously have a big need for funding. That's part of going into a collaboration is, here's the mission that I have of this nonprofit, and I need funding for it. What are some of the other needs of the nonprofit in a true collaboration?
I think that there is a sense that nonprofits need some sort of recognition for their work, because that does help to drive the fundraising. So there is often a brand management aspect to the way that nonprofits want to put forward their work. And collaboration oftentimes means that they have to step back away from that. It has to be something where their mission is being served, truly. However, there's a larger theory of change that they're buying into, that they're a part of, that is, in fact, moving the needle on an issue. The missions are often only a niche of some larger systemic issue in society. And oftentimes nonprofits are treating the symptoms and not the systemic issue. And so the opportunities to partner with government through the possibilities of the influence that they have, and also the enormous amount of funds that they have. So that need for brand management is a challenge, I think, to collaboration. And the ability for organizations to look beyond just their mission and how their mission is a part of a larger systemic issue that they're trying to solve.
I think nonprofits oftentimes annex the power of why government wants to contract with them. Why would government want to contract with a nonprofit? There's a variety of reasons. One is nonprofits can do things that government can't. Two is nonprofits are often way better conveners and understand community need way better than government does, and can ride volatility much better. But oftentimes nonprofits go to government and say, you tell me what I should do, and essentially give away the power that they have as a community institution.
In a collaboration, what are some of the needs of the funder? What are you wanting to see, happen? I had somebody say to me recently, well, I just wish that more nonprofits, kind of speaking to what Jim had said, but on the flip side, would be less territorial so we could see more collective impact with the funding that we're giving. We want to see our dollars stretch more. Is that kind of a...
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that I think should happen in order for our collaboration to really work if there's a fund, like the funder is at the table. And I think that there has to be clarity as to exactly what you want to achieve, so people really understand and get okay, this is what we want to what we want to focus on achieving together. The other one is that there needs to be, that co-creation, that shared goal and metrics also, like, this is exactly what we want to measure. And then there's a benefit for me when I go back, and hopefully these conversations and whatever we want to focus on also gives value back to my organization. Otherwise, you run the risk of having people sitting and, oh, this is great, and then they go back and nothing really changes.
And how do you determine, where those resources go?
Well, I think
from that standpoint, whatever the collaboration is, whether it's small, middle, big, you're going to have limited resources. You're going to have a finite amount with certain goals. But how do you actually, and Liesl, you and I had kind of touched on this in a prior conversation before the show, how do you determine who in the community needs the money or where those resources should be? What do you look at?
I think, for government, it's really looking at metrics are a huge piece of the conversation. Who's getting results and for which targeted populations? And I think in our community right now, we're seeing great disparities. And so government and the philanthropic community has really invested in certain communities. And so really looking at how do we improve outcomes for specific populations, and how can we manage, how can we take a continuous improvement look at that data so that we know that we're making progress.
So is that something that the government, the business, the nonprofit all sit down at the table and collectively say, these are some important metrics, this is some important impact, this is the important change that we need to make?
I think in the most effective collaborations, you have that common vision of what you're trying to achieve, and then you have that common way of looking at how are we measuring our success. And I think we plan and do really well. How do we do that study and act piece? And I think that's where the area of improvement is around collaboration. So how do we really roll up our sleeve and say, that's working really well, this isn't? How do we actually refine our actions based on that?
John just keeps shaking his head. I don't know if you've noticed that. He's like, yes.
Yeah, my sense is, and this might be somewhat controversial, but my sense is this is also a place where nonprofits lose their power. And running a philanthropy now, I want to know what impact I want, and I want to be clear on that. And that's my goal, is to get real clear on the impact and the plateau shifts I want to see change in a community. It is not my job to dictate what performance measures I want to see in a community. And obviously on the government side, you have a whole set of policy things that before it gets to you, you have indicators that are already set before you, which is unfortunate, quite honestly. But from my end, if I'm good at what I do, I'm clear about what I want to get to, and then I allow nonprofits to tell me what the performance measures are. The challenge has been it's been reversed, and often 60 to 70% of the nonprofit sector is small to mid-sized nonprofits. I don't think any of them have an R&D department, and it's hard for them.
Anyone in here? Do you have an R&D department?
Anybody have R&D?
Okay.
It's just it's not something that they have, and so they've become organizations that are drowning themselves in paperwork. And nobody has a clear idea on what impacts they want. They just know that we want lots of stuff, right? So I remember going in and meeting with the top 7 philanthropy funders in a really large city, I'll say it that way, and then saying to them, tell me where the needs of poverty are going. And they looked at me like I was showing a dog a card trick. They had no idea where those needs were going, and it's because they weren't reading the information. They just were in the process of asking for stuff, and so they weren't learning organizations. And so for me, I want to create a nonprofit sector that are learners and are learning from their data and advancing on that data, and not just asking them from data, which is something that funders and government are really good at doing, but learning from it sometimes is challenging.
Well, and
Something that I think is important is that it's not just about collection, it's about analysis and then that adaptiveness that comes with it. And I think there's not enough funding that supports the analysis
No, that's a
of,
good point.
of the information. So some organizations have 100 employees and have one data manager person, right? So if you put that in a realistic context, how much is that person gonna be able to do with the data from 60 different programs that have 4 different databases? So I think that that's a systems type conversation where if foundations or government would like to see more of that story, that analysis, and really show me what it is you're doing, then there needs to be more investment on that side. So in organizational capacities or the nonprofits or other agencies can also increase that area of their work.
It's an interesting challenge because on the one hand, you want to fuel as much of your program as you can to make the most change. But on the other hand, you need that funding to go towards the analysis that you're talking about of that data. But how many times have you been able to go before a board and the board says, yes, but if we could feed 250 more people versus having this, maybe we could do the data analysis next year. Or, it's almost like we need this infusion within the nonprofit sector it's comprehensive. This is a much bigger conversation than simply one session at an annual conference, but I love the fact that you guys are here and joining us. We are going to lead now towards another break, so I want to say a big aha to our studio audience. Thank you guys for being with us today. We'll take a short break, and we will be right back with the Philanthropy Show. Does this sound familiar? Do your friends and family keep telling you, get on Facebook? Or maybe you already are on Facebook, but you find yourself stuck, not quite sure what to do. I've been teaching social media for more than 6 years to entrepreneurs, small businesses, and nonprofits, and I've helped many of my friends who are themselves grandparents get set up and familiar with the basics of Facebook. I've been waiting for a class just made for grandparents and boomers to come along so I could pass it on to them. And then I realized, why am I waiting? So I reached out to a couple dozen or so of our grandparent friends, asking them, what are your main questions and frustrations around using Facebook? And that's what this course is all about. Using screen recordings like this one, I will walk you through the answers and also use markup tools to point out specific things that I think are important for those lectures. In addition, I've put together some documents for you that you can use as resource guides. You can print these or download them and access what you've just learned in the previous lecture or in the previous section. You can take this course at your own speed, skip to lectures that answer your main questions first, or take the lectures in order to build your knowledge base. So, are you ready to have fun and learn about this Facebook thing? Enroll today, and I'll see you in class. Enroll today at thephilanthropyshow.com.
Follow The Philanthropy Show on Facebook for behind-the-scenes action, polls, and commentary.
Tampa police searching for 2 dangerous men who shot a man twice in his own home. It's all happening in Sulphur Springs.
Police raiding this building. Just upstairs, cops pulling out pounds of marijuana and growing materials.
For years, drugs and violence have been the scene in Sulphur Springs, a tough, impoverished neighborhood in Tampa, Florida. But thanks to a full-scale collaboration involving residents, 45 local nonprofits, and over 20 area businesses, funders, and the county government, that's changing. The Sulphur Springs Neighborhood of Promise has already been tested through several years of development and planning, bringing partners and stakeholders together in a cohesive and clearly defined plan governed by a leadership council.
We have all the major stakeholders represented at the CEO level on that leadership council. All we do is foster collaboration. We're not providing direct services. Our only role is to be sure that everybody's working well together.
I think one of the most appealing parts of Sulphur Springs and the Neighborhood of Promise was the very strong relationship between the nonprofits and the district, which you don't often see.
That's what speaks to the project a little bit too, because you cannot do neighborhood-based work if the community is not ready for it.
Maria Negron with the Children's Board of Hillsborough County, a children's services council and funder through taxpayer dollars. Ann Reinert, J.P. Morgan Chase & Company, and Chef Crowder, the Kahn Foundation, agree that transforming a poverty-stricken neighborhood is a huge and complex task. So the initiative has focused on creating a culture that promotes the caring, nurturing, and successful education of children through the combined and focused efforts of the collaborative team.
And it wasn't just one organization doing all of the work, but everybody identified with what their role was.
For the collaboration to work, they first had to define their approach and agree to a multi-year timeline.
Our natural path is we have early childhood to elementary to middle school to high school. What we needed to work on was how do you transition from early childhood to elementary to so forth.
Communities have very complex issues, and communities are ever changing, so you can't possibly see your impact after just a short amount of time being involved or having an intervention in place.
The initiative has not been instantly successful. A goal this big includes an holistic educational approach, safer family-friendly streets, and children and their families living in an environment encouraging success and better education. And an initial stumble in determining data helped them focus on 4 areas they can measure: parental involvement, attendance, social-emotional learning, and academic achievement.
When things weren't working, they all addressed it. Everyone's held accountable and produce the outcomes that everybody expects. And if they don't continue down the path that's unsuccessful. They stop, reassess, and readjust.
What we're really trying to do is start with the end in mind. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And again, our theory is if we can be successful in those 4 areas, we will end up with better educated children.
All partners, nonprofits, businesses, and government follow an agreed-upon discourse with transparency. If something's not working, communicate. Include everyone. Ask and listen.
I think that's how it really grows from there. When people start to look at information from a very thoughtful perspective, when you genuinely include people from the diverse community on all levels, and when you can share what your contributions are and understand how you're each, making an impact on something that means something to all of you, when you could all agree on this is what we want to focus on and this is how we can do it.
Case example with the Sulphur Springs Neighborhood of Promise, really I wanted to show the beginning, middle stages. This is something that began 6 years ago, but it's just now getting its wheels. So in talking about, as we were in the second segment, the different needs that everybody has, and how do we determine what are the essential community needs and the resources, and how do we target those? Let's talk a little bit about that. From Mayra, from a community readiness standpoint, how do you know what to target in on from all of the issues that you have out there?
I think that comes from that co-creation process or co-development of, identifying the priorities and saying, first, what is the overarching goal or the vision within the collaborative? And then after you solidify that is, okay, what are the actionable things that we can all decide on that are really gonna make an impact on this issue area? Mm-hmm. So I think that's all hopefully decided by whoever's at the table. And then from that you get the measurements, and then you get, the strategies and the actions that come after, you have okay, we wanna do this, but then the implementation phase begins. So I think that from my experience, that's more, what really works and keeps organizations engaged, but then also you need to back that up with data. Okay, we're looking at the deepest inequities. For example, you can look at, what's the data saying from within our organizations, and where are the deepest or the biggest opportunities in a case. What can we come together and decide on to have a greater effect in X, 5, 10, whatever years that you want to focus on, right? And then based on that information, you come up with your action and your strategies, and you start the implementation. And then it becomes about how are you collecting the data, how are you using it, how are you reassessing, and how are you constantly having a quality improvement system that allows you to keep moving forward and be successful, 5, 10 years down the line.
Recognizing that there's going to be different levels of capacity within a collaboration is also important, but determining who are the right players at the table does take time, it does take relations, and it takes the group being willing to come back and think again about, almost regularly using as a touchstone that issue that they're trying to move the needle on, using those metrics as a touchstone and trying to challenge themselves on, are we still relevant to this issue? Not just are we, as organizations, are we resilient and sustainable ourselves, but are we relevant
Well, you're
to
talking
this
about a
issue?
60,000 foot level. In stepping away from the actual work on the street to step back to that 60,000 foot level, what are your thoughts in the video example, the case study that we said of the Leadership Council, which is what they've done in planting, you know, the CEOs to put them in that position to do exactly what you're saying, Jim?
I think it's a good model. I mean, it can have challenges, definitely. There is the, you know, laser cat with pointer effect sometimes for nonprofits, for funders, for government. You know, when you go through 2 and 4 and 6 year election cycles, you know, I've certainly been on the receiving end of, wait, no, our priority is this. But I think that keeping in the forefront that larger systemic needle moving issue as the touchstone of what you're trying to do as a collaborative is vital.
What are some others that might be, and I don't want everybody to think that it has to be a huge countywide, although to John's point, you're going to have it's going to be around a larger issue if there is a collaboration. But some that have worked or some that have not worked, some success or some failures that you've seen in collaborations.
One that comes to mind, and this actually is an old one that has adapted and is now sort of business as usual, which is kind of exciting to see a collaboration become that. So Oregon used to be #1 in hunger, really was challenged by people participating in the SNAP program. The state saw that as an issue, mostly because the feds called the governor and said, you might want to pay attention to this issue. And the government wasn't at that time very mobile about engaging people to apply for SNAP benefits.
When you say SNAP, just
food stamps.
Okay.
Food stamp program. So community-based organizations came and said, you know, we can help get people enrolled in SNAP eligibility. We're out there in food banks and in community-based organizations, and we know who these people are. We'll help you, but you also have to streamline your business practices and actually get people enrolled when they come through your doors. So at the time it was very contentious, but they were driven by data. They had a common goal. We want to make sure that people in the state are not as hungry as they had been. And it was the best of the community-based organizations who could be flexible and dynamic and culturally specific to their communities, and the government who had to change their practices. And now that group meets regularly and looks at the data to say, you know, where are we? We have nearly 100% SNAP participation right now in Oregon, and largely due to the state changing practices, but that deep collaboration with communities. So if, for example, Latinos in a particular community are not enrolled at the same rate that they should be, then there's targeted strategies to those communities to be enrolled. And it's the state and those partners sitting down together and doing that work.
And have they had to
partnership.
redefine?
They have had to redefine, and they've each had to change, and I think that's another example of a collaboration that can be adaptive and responsive. And now it literally is a standing meeting, and it's I don't think people call it a collaboration anymore. I think they just think of it as part of their jobs, that they come together to do the work.
That's great. But what did you find in your research from a national or an international perspective along these lines of successful collaborations? Are there some key factors?
Yeah, I mean, my sense of what I saw around collaboration is, and I think of the story that Secretary of State Powell tells. He tells a story of this collection of aunts called AuntNet that was around before the internet, and it was essentially his aunts that lived on the block to make sure that he got home on time. And so they would just yell out the window, you know, Colin, get home, right? And that, from my standpoint, when collaborations start to look and make logos and things like that, that's when it becomes worrisome. And I find that the best collaboratives are those collaboratives that are small, right? So there's a collaboration of women who lost a friend to a really terrible strand of breast cancer called triple-negative breast cancer. And these moms came together and formed around that and have been doing great work. And their intention wasn't to create a global brand around a collaborative model. Their thing was very specific. And so my sense would be, as I look at the countries that I've been in, looking at government and nonprofit partnerships, it doesn't matter where you go, whether it's Northern Ireland or Australia or Trinidad or Tobago or all those other places that I've been, it's small mom and pop collaboratives that are collaborating with a very specific place, and the idea that everyone around that table has a voice and equal power to solving the issue that they're formed around, whether it's making sure that someone gets home or it's working on a strand of breast cancer or whatever, is probably, in my mind, the most gritty and best form of collaboratives that I like. So.
I think that what an awesome idea for a book too, and I bet you had just a ball doing research going around. Wow! And again, I want to say the name of John's book: "Rebalancing Public Partnerships: Innovative Practice Between Government and Nonprofits from Around the World," and it will be available this fall.
I have a copy for you.
Well, thank you.
There you go.
Very cool. As we head now into the break, we'll be right back with the Philanthropy Show, coming to you from Portland, Oregon, Portland State University. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, John. Thank you, Liesl, Mayra, and Jim. And thank you, our studio audience in Portland State University and the Alliance for Nonprofit Management, for bringing the Philanthropy Show to this beautiful state and beautiful city. We wish you all the best, and be sure that you join us next Monday at 4 for an all-new Philanthropy Show. And check out the past shows tabs for more. See you next time. Yay!
Do you have an idea for the Philanthropy Show? Contact us via our website or email us at tps@myvideovoice.com.